Okay, it's now a few minutes past the hour, so we'll go ahead and get started. Before I go any further, I'd just like to do a quick audio check and make sure that everybody can hear me okay. So if you could go to your chat window and just give me a heads up if you're hearing me, then we'll go ahead and get started. Great. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Trying out a new audio setup today, so we'll see how this works out. So good morning, my name is Joe Miller. I'm the Learning Strategy Manager here at Alteryx, and today we're going to talk about building your first in-database workflow. If you've never done it before, you're in the right place. What we hope to do is introduce you how to build a workflow and really say it's not that hard once you get into it. The hardest part, honestly, is setting up that connection to make sure that you're connecting to your database properly. So let's go ahead and dive in. Before we go any further, we're just going to talk about this agenda here today. So what we usually do is just make some introductions, what we do on the live training side, talk about Alteryx Academy. We're going to go through some workflow background, things you need to know before we actually jump into the designer. And then finally, we go into the designer and demo some of the functionality. If you want to follow along with today's session, if you go to community.alteryx.com into our live training section, you'll see under the post that you came into for this WebEx meeting, there is an NDB YXVP. By the nature of this training, it may be difficult to follow along just because this workflow is configured to connect to my database right now, and you would have to go in and basically load the file, the transactions XML file, into your own sandbox in order to follow along. So for many of you, it might just be worth just watching this one. If not, what I have done is I have, as part of the package, included just the raw XML file. So if you wanted to import it into your database and follow along, then you're more than welcome to do so. So that is available for you, and then after this session, we'll be posting up the recording. So if things just moved a little fast and you wanted to retry it with something in your database, certainly you can go back and rewatch everything that we did here today. Before we go any further, too, I just want to mention that we do have some housekeeping items, the first of which is if you have any questions for me, go ahead and enter them into the Q&A window. The Q&A window is available up at the top of your screen. If you hover over it, you'll see there's a selection for it. There is a difference between the Q&A and chat windows and WebEx, and it can be kind of confusing what to put where. So as a general ground rule, I just say put it in the Q&A. It allows me to mark what I have addressed and what I haven't, so I make sure that all questions are covered to the best of my ability. If there's something that comes up right at the moment that I can address, I'll try to address it then. If it's better served at the end of the session, I'll try to do it there. And then if it's something that I'm not able to answer, we'll take it out to a larger community after the session. So you got a quick glimpse. Maybe you're here for live trainings, but what else is available to you on that community? The community is an awesome and powerful place where you can go ahead and ask your questions, get answers very quickly, super quickly. Compared to other communities out there, it's probably the quickest that I've ever seen. You can share your knowledge, you can connect with your peers, whether they're doing the same processes or in the same industries. You can discover new use cases. You could submit your ideas for our product. We like to be very transparent with where the product is going. So you can go ahead and set that up. We'll say if it's in progress or if it's backlogged or if we plan it for the next release. You'll see it all there, and then you can read insightful blogs. And for me, the part that I'm most involved in is the Alteryx Academy, which is what you're in right now. The Alteryx Academy hosts some of the live training sessions, but what we do have outside of that is our interactive lessons, weekly challenges, and our free product certification program. For interactive lessons, you can go in there, and let me just pull up my window so we can see that again. If I click on interactive lessons, you'll see that I have courses that will track my progress, and within each course, I have a set of lessons. Just this week, we released a new course for those spatial gurus who are looking to get spun up on that. That is now available, developed by Christine Bontheus. It's one of our best lessons to date, and we continue to improve that academy, our interactive lesson experience as we go on. Next, we have the weekly challenge. The weekly challenge is a really exciting area to put your knowledge to practice. It's for those who like to learn by doing. So if you'd like to go in, try out a few of our challenges. We have a nice weekly challenge index, so if you want to go ahead and choose just the beginner rated ones, you can go in there, select those. Maybe you want to do something that's oriented to data preparation. Everything's mapped out in that index. It's a really great way to navigate through there without getting too confused. And then finally, we have our certification program. You may or may not have been through it yet, but we have 2 exams live with a 3rd one on the way. So that's something else to check out, completely free. Go ahead and prove your knowledge there. It's one of our greatest assessment and learning tools that we have here in community. Some upcoming live trainings that we have beyond today will be our parsing regular expressions next week. And then leading into May, we're going to talk a little bit about analytic app development for intermediate users. We're going to be running our first ever core certification prep session, so be sure to check that out. We'll be running our first ever advanced spatial analytics session, so also check that out. And then finally, we'll be rounding off the month of May with understanding data types. Do note that we will not be following up Memorial Day with any training, so we'll be off that week and the week thereafter because we'll be at our yearly conference in the States here called Inspire. And if you're not aware of Inspire, also check that out because it's one of the most exciting things of the year for Alteryx. So workflow background, what are we going to be doing today? Okay, our business user has a SAS file with customer data, and all the transactional data is sitting inside a database, right? And so since they have one local, one in database, there's no real efficient way to blend them together. So what we're going to do today is kind of bring together those 2 worlds and blend those 2 files in database, perform a logistic regression, and a lot of this data is based around, are they going to be a responder to my campaign or not a responder, and then write results back to a database. So that's what we're going to do. So what tools are we going to cover? You can see there's a quick snapshot of the workflow that we're going to be building. The good news is if you know how to use the favorite tools of Alteryx, you know how to use a lot of these in-database tools. There's going to be a lot of nuanced differences when working with these workflows, but I'll be sure to point them out along the way. So let's talk about why in database. We're going to talk about streaming in and out and optimizing workflows in the slides to come here. So what are the benefits to in database? Well, in database can be more performant depending on what you want to do, right? Sometimes if I'm working off a database that's hosted in New York and I'm living in Colorado, I don't want to shift the context, aka process it externally in Alteryx and export it from the database into Alteryx, do analysis and re-upload it into the database, right? That can be a very, very slow process if I'm crossing essentially that border between in database and in memory. And for the duration of this session, I'll differentiate those 2 as in database and in memory. So when I work with Alteryx just normally, right, I'm connecting to a file and I'm bringing that data in memory into the designer. What you're doing in database is the data is not living in designer, it's processing all database side. So locality and geography can really play a big factor when it comes to working within database. It could also be speed, right? So it might be something that data governance has set up where they've indexed this table in a certain way that it runs blazing fast, right? And you want to be able to leverage how they've set that up inside the federation engine, right? So there are certain scenarios where you can test different scenarios. Does it work better in memory? Does it work better in database? So we're going to show you a few different examples that you can go with. But for a lot of people, it's just a lot less headache just to keep it in database side and just process everything there without moving everything back and forth. But for the purpose of today's presentation, we'll show you how to leverage the back and forth functionality of Alteryx. So what are the supported databases? Every single release we have new levels of support. Here's a whole listing of them. I could read them all to you. Maybe you can just point out a few that you're using here today. If it's something outside of these, that's not natively built into Alteryx, so you might have to check that out a little bit more. I do have a few that are asterisked, so Microsoft SQL Server, Oracle, Teradata. These are marked because they contain in-database capabilities. So some of our predictive tools you can use in database without having to externalize them. So just a few visual key differences before we get into the actual functionality, right? So I've got a comparison left and right here on my slides left showing our in-memory, just normal Alteryx tools, and then on the right, in-database tools. On the left, you can see one big difference is the anchors, right? The anchors are green, they have arrows, whereas the in-database, they're a little bit more rectangles, and you can see the piping on the connectors is double piped, and I would just drag them in and connect. Now, the general rule of thumb is that you cannot connect a green to blue or a blue to green. The connections always have to be blue to blue or green to green. That's why that visual representation is there, is I can't just simply connect my input data directly to a browse-in database. We have a tool that kind of converts those colors, for lack of a better word, so you can cross over those platforms. So just like I said before, right, the real benefit outside of just utilizing your database context is that you can work inside your database without having to know SQL, right? So for some of you, you might be getting things like this, right, from other business analysts. It's not really easy to understand what's going on here. It's certainly not as easy as a workflow. And you just want to leverage your knowledge of Alteryx and use it in database. And that's where it's all at today. And the great news, like I mentioned before, if you know the favorites tools, you know how to use in database, there's just going to be a few nuances along the way. So here's our example of the first hybrid workflow, right? And we can talk in binary sense that I'm only building a workflow all in database, or I'm only building a workflow all in memory in Alteryx. But here's an example of something that's doing both. So you can see this is somewhat similar to the workflow that we're about to build, where I have a local file that may be getting sent to me every week, right? And I'm just doing a quick auto field, and there's something called this data stream in tool. This data stream in essentially converts from in-memory and places it into your database. Now, a few things can happen. Typically what we see is people just push it into a temporary table, if that pertains to you or matters to you. And they create that table in order to join to what already exists inside the database. At the end, they might stream out and save it to a local file. You might keep it in database to create a new table. So there are a lot of different ways to go with it, but that's showing you that you can work in memory and in database at the same time. Now I do have a question that says you need write access into the database to use this. You'll certainly need write access to do temporary tables in order to stream in. And then the next level is actually writing complete tables. Then if you want to actually save those tables inside your database, then you'll have to make sure that you get that. And certainly a lot of discussion here today is going to be wrapped around talking with IT every once in a while, right? So making sure, or your database administrators, making sure that you have the rights that you want. And then also there's going to be some of the setup stuff in terms of the drivers that you need and the credentials that you need to get into your database. That'll certainly be part of the conversation, which is why I say that's usually the most difficult part of building in database workflows. But once you get that all set up, you're good to go, right? I am getting another question that's saying the package on community cannot be opened in older versions of Alteryx. Is there another way to be able to open the file and follow it? I can show you a way. It is unsupported, but this is something to do if you do have troubles working with your file. I'm just going to unzip this file, which is exactly what's in the community. Okay, I've extracted it. So what it will do is it'll create a folder of all the assets that went into that zipped workflow. And you can see that workflow raw here. And I'm just going to edit in the notepad. And over here, you can see that the first line of code, if you open it as an XML file, is labeled 2018.1. If I was working in version 11, I would just click that and save. So that's a great way of going back. Now, I will say that it is unsupported to do that. We don't encourage people making changes, but this is how a lot of people do this. Okay. So when I'm talking about working with hybrid workflows, when's the best to do where, right? When would I use an in-database workflow versus an input tool that would connect into my database? So here's two examples, right? one on the left, one on the right, standard workflow. In this case, my first input data tool is actually connecting to a database, and it's importing 2 million records that are brought into the memory of Alteryx and then joined to 380 records to produce a table of about 230,000 records. A majority of time that takes to run the workflow is actually spent on those 2 million records, not only because they're big, but again, we get back into that conversation of locality. So as I'm starting to stream them across my database and bring them into the memory of my designer, that can take a little bit more time. Conversely, if I want to do some sort of logic, as I have done on the right, I've left my larger data source in database, right, my 2 million records. And instead of importing 2 million into memory, why don't I take the 380 from my memory and put them into my in database, right? And there I can join them, I can do all my analysis and output them. So net-net, the workflow might run faster because we're transferring a smaller volume of data to one side or the other, right? So always think about the actual volume that you'll be working with along the way. So those are some of the basics, high-level overview. Let's go ahead and get started on building a workflow. I'm going to pause a moment and make sure that there are no more questions before I get into this. Okay. So let's go ahead and get started here. Now, what I'll be working with today is Microsoft SQL Server Express. It's essentially a local database that sits on my machine. So when I talk about the difficulties of locality and where your database actually is, right now this database is on my machine, so you won't see some of the struggle that you usually have when it comes to importing records from your database if you're pushing it in and out of memory. So I'll just make that note before I go into this. And then also, just remember that we're working with your native database, right? I like to say when we're working with SQL Server, we have to speak in the SQL Server language, right? If we're working with Oracle, we have to work in an Oracle language. And we'll touch on that a little bit more. But first, let's connect to my table, okay? And if I go over here, you can see I've got this very robust database here of one table called transactions. And I'm going to go ahead and connect to that inside of my designer, okay? So I'm going to close this down. I'm going to go in and go to my in-database tools and say connect in DB, right? And the key word being connect in DB, a lot of people say this is the input data, right? But I think we use the word connect because we're not actually bringing data into Designer at this point. We're just processing it back in the database, but we're just connecting to it. So that's where we set the differentiation. Now, if this is your first time, you likely have nothing here underneath the connection name, okay? You can see that I've connected to this SQL Server demo in the past. I will walk through at a very quick rate of how you might connect to it. Certainly, you could spend a whole session on understanding how to connect to your database, but there are a lot of different ways and a lot of different needs based on a lot of different organizations, and we could spend a lot of time on that. But for now, let's just go in and just say we're going to manage a new connection, right? And in here, you'll get this dialog called Manage in-DB Connections. There's actually multiple ways to access this, and I'll show you after I configure my new connection. I'm going to choose the data source that I'm working on, which is Microsoft SQL Server. I can choose if I'm using the user or file connection type. I'm leaving it as user. And I can choose to choose either an existing one, which I've built before, or create a new one. So I'll just create a new one. It'll essentially be the same connection, but we'll go ahead and do that. So I'm going to call this Joe's Demo for the connection name. And you don't have to worry about really what you name. This is really what makes sense to you. Really what you're creating here is an alias, right? So when people go in, they can just see the connection name and not the actual connection itself. So let's go in and configure how we're going to read and write to this database. And again, we have to make sure, you know, we have access to do each of these. So I'm going to go ahead and choose a connection string and generate a new connection string. I'll say a new database connection. I'll be given a few different types of ways that I can connect to my data. I'm going to use the native client in order to connect to my data. And again, This is a conversation that you'll probably need to have with your DBA in terms of what's best to select. Next, I'm going to enter my server name, and I conveniently, when I signed in, you might, if you already have access to something like Microsoft SQL Server, you're already logging into it. So when I logged in, here's what I saw in my SQL Server login server name as. So I'm going to go ahead and enter that in. I'm going to pop this on my other screen so I don't keep missing it here. Okay, and I'm using Windows Integrated Security, so I'm just using my Windows AD. For some of you, you might be given specific usernames or passwords, and there's a whole conversation that we can have around that. In this case, whenever I update my Windows password, my password to this database should also update because it's part of my integrated security. One of the difficulties when using a specific username and password is you'll have to come back and edit these whenever your password changes, which is good if you manage it through this data connections, because anywhere else where you use that name that I called Joe's Demo, right, it'll update the passwords for those. So it's a great way of scalably working with in database workflows. But in this case, I'm just using my integrated security. And I'm going to choose the database that I'm going to be working with, which I know my table sits in the master database. I'll test the connection, and I see I am successful. Okay. Oh, and I failed to do one more thing. I didn't configure my write settings, so I have read but not write. I'm just going to say same as read driver in this case. So it'll just take everything that I've entered in here for this connection string and apply it to my read driver, or sorry, my write driver. Okay, so I'll get you can see my connection name is now showing up as Joe's Demo. I do have that one table. I'll click on it, and good. I should be connected to it. I'll just use a browsing DB just to check with it. I'll run, and you can see I'm getting data back. So I have my first successful connection. So let's go ahead and bring in our local file, and then we'll keep going. So let's go to our in-out data, and I'm going to connect to that customer SAS file. I have it in my recent files, so I'll just connect to it there. Okay, so the first thing that we want to do, right, I have my customer data and I have my transactional data. I'm going to want to blend them together and then do a logistic regression to see, I'm going to run this new campaign, and I just want to see what the chances are that these people or these customers of mine are going to respond to my campaign based on my transactions, okay? So here's where we can make a decision, right? What do you think I have more of, customers or transactions? Well, without going in and doing a specific check, I would assume that one customer would have multiple transactions. So likely I'm going to be working with a lot more transactions data than I would be customer data. That's not always true. It's good to set forth the precedent that you should check out those numbers before you start building it. But we're just kind of working in a siloed environment right now. Again, this database is local to me, so I could flip it back and forth, and we probably wouldn't see a difference in speed, whereas if you were missing a different locality, then it would be different. So let's go in, and I'm just going to quick autofield this tool. By default, everything's coming in as a view string, and I'm going to bring this data set in database in order to blend it with my transactions table. So what I'm going to do is go to my in-database palette. And by the way, if you do not see this by default, go over to this little plus sign on the right-hand side, and you can see that there's a selection of tool palettes. Make sure that your in-database is selected, and everything will be showing up. If not, you can always search up here in the top right corner and find what you need. Okay, so I'm going to choose a data stream in, okay? So it's always interesting because the names of these can be a little difficult to understand what you're doing, but there's two different ones called data stream in and data stream out. If you look at the icons a little closer, they actually make a little bit of sense. So you can see that data streaming into that little database there, so you're streaming into it. I'm sure it's a matter of perspective because you could think that data streaming into Designer, but really we're streaming it into the database. But you can see here this is one of those unique tools that's got two different anchor colors, right? So I've been able to connect a green to a green, and now I can connect blue to blues. So I just need to configure this really quick, and it just needs to say, hey, what database are you connecting to? And of course, I want to put it to the same database that I'm analyzing in. So I'm going to set as Joe's demo, and you can see that I could just create a new persistent table. I could create a temporary table, and I could overwrite an existing one. Okay, so I'm just going to create a temporary table, so when I can disconnect from my session, I don't have to worry about it, right? It just kind of disappears. So I'll go ahead and run that, right, just to test it out. Connection works well. We're all happy, okay? So I've got one side of my join all set up and good to go. On the other side, I need to do a little bit of preparation, okay? So the first thing is that I'm just going to skinny down my transaction data set just a little bit. So I have a few things that I'm just going to select. And this is the first big tool of the favorites that we're going to see inside of our canvas. So you can see that it looks a little different, right? I have the ability to select, deselect, rearrange, rename, but I am missing descriptions and the ability to change data types here. So I'm going to go in and just select the fields that I need. I'm just going to deselect all of them to start. I'm going to go to unit price, customer ID, and quantity ordered new. I really need these three. And I know in the future, the reason that I'm skinning it down now is that I'm going to bring it back into my memory. So the more data and the skinnier that I can get that data before I start crossing back into that in-memory, the better off I'm going to be in the long run. Okay? So I'm just going to disconnect this browse tool here and just repurpose it at the end of this one. And we're just going to take a look at the browse tool and see how that's different. Okay, so you can see by default, we don't have any browse everywhere functionality that you have inside the designer, right? So when you're working in database, you're likely going to be using this tool a lot. By default, we just look at the first 100 records so as not to swamp it. And additional to that, we enable caching, right? So if I were to rerun this workflow again and again, I'm not re-executing the same query against my database. I'm not swamping it, and I'm not going to get flagged by my database administrator. Alteryx is smart enough to know that since nothing has really changed upstream, that it's not worth querying the same content all over again, right, or the same data. Now, if I did want to get a refreshed view, I could deselect enabled caching, right, run it, and then it's actually executing against the database again. And as soon as I make another change, it clears the cache and runs again. Okay, so that's important to know, and it's kind of helpful for testing that it's just not going to keep pummeling your database if you're not changing things upstream of it. Okay, so let's go ahead and start building a formula. So I'm going to drag a formula into my canvas here, and then we're going to work with the formula tool. So you'll notice that when we rolled out the version 10.5 of our designer, we revamped our formula tool, whereas this one kind of stayed the way it's been in the past. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new field, and I'm going to call this one transaction amount. Okay, and I'll leave it as a double. Now here's where things get a little difficult and very different, right? And where I talked about each database has its own language, right? So if I'm working in Spark, it might be different. How I'm working in Oracle might be different. How I'm using Microsoft SQL Server, there's different functions available. There's different structuring for case statements, right? So if there's any point where you have to know a pseudo SQL, for lack of a better word, this would be the point. And I'll say for a lot of stuff that we do, it's very easy to find those resources, okay? So here we have, I'm just going to do a simple multiplier. I just want to see how many people have ordered, how many items they've ordered and what that price is, just to get the total transaction amount for that particular customer. So I'm going to go ahead and insert some fields from my database. So I'm going to say my unit price times the quantity ordered, and that will be my transaction amount. And that's it, okay? Now, that didn't seem so hard, but it could get a little bit more complex if I decided to do something like, I'll just say, let's see, let me look at the fields here. So I'll just do unit price rating. So that is a V string. And I was to write a case statement, right? Now this is something that we might write with if then else inside of Alteryx. But I know since I'm working with Microsoft SQL Server, I'd be writing something called a case statement, which in a lot of ways is very similar. It's just different keywords. So I'll say when the unit price is greater than $5, then high, else low, end. Okay, and you can see that there's some of that syntactic highlighting that might be working inside your database. So if something's not highlighting that you would normally expect to, be sure to check it out. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to move my browse tool down one more just so we can view the progress on that. Make sure that those formulas work, and they do, right? So I only demonstrate this second one just to say it's not too scary to write in your native database language, but just be sure to check it out, right? Look at what the keywords are there, and it'll make it working with it a lot easier. And I'll say between this and the filter, right, that's probably the biggest differences than working inside of Alteryx, and that's probably just how you're writing expressions a little differently, okay? So let's go ahead and aggregate some of our data. So finally, I want to take it down and just measure how much each of my customers have actually spent. So I'm going to group by my customer. I'm going to sum their total transaction. And I'll just rename this to total. And then I want to count transactions, so I'll just count how many they have. Okay, so I've essentially prepared the right side of my join here, and I'll do one more browse here just to make sure that we're all on track with the same data set here. So you can see I have one customer who's spent $416 across 8 transactions. Okay. And now I want to join that customer information back to my customer. And you see the information they have over here is what store they were in, what the segment was, have they been a responder to campaigns before or not, what their address is, their location, transactions per year. Some interesting stats like have they finished university, what's their income, their home value. And we're going to use a lot of these to go in and kind of predict if they're going to be responders to our campaign. But now you'll notice that I've got 2 tables nicely squared up for a join in database. Time to go to a join tool. Okay. Well, wait, time out. Something's a little different here. Well, you'll notice that we don't have 3 outputs, right? We only have 1 output of this join tool. Normally, if we're in database, or sorry, in memory, you would see a L, R, and a J representing left join, right join, and just inner join. You'll see that that selection happens down here. Your first one is inner join. So that really, let me just bring in a join tool just to show you what anchors I'm referring to. So this little J output, aka what is common between both data sets, what exists in both data sets, is representative of the inner join. Okay. Now, these 3 are just going to be a little bit more different, and it's more reflective of database behaviors because what we really do inside of Alteryx, we call these left inner joins and right inner joins. So in this input, it says, hey, what's not in my left? And conversely, in the left, it says what's not in my right. But when I do a left outer join, what it really is the outputs of L and J union together, right? So it's anything from the left that didn't join in addition to the data that was able to join. The right outer join, conversely, is the union of the J and the R output. So what was able to join and what was not able to join from the right input. And then a full outer join is just a full union of all the outputs together, right? So it would literally look something like this. Just what did join, what didn't join from the left, what didn't join from the right, okay? So that's really the behaviors that's underlying that that join tool. In this case, I'm only interested in working with customers that I have data for in order to do my analysis. So I'm just going to do an inner join on them. So I'm going to go in and just select customer ID for each side of my join, make sure inner join is selected, and I'm good to go. Okay, so we'll do another browse in DB. Run that. Okay, so it does appear that I do have data joining, which is most excellent. Okay, so it's time. I've got my data set all squared up nicely. Time to do some predictive analysis. Okay, now there's two different ways that I can go with this. I can do predictive analysis in database or outside of my database. Now, for some of the most common databases like Microsoft SQL Server, Oracle, and Teradata, I can just do it in database. So let's go and check it out. Oh wait, where's my predictive tools? Well, here's kind of a little hidden fact about some of our predictive tools. If I'm working in database canvas and I were to drag on, say, linear regression, you'll see that I've drug on essentially an in-database version of it. So it's a little bit hidden by nature, but it is there, okay? Now, that can be a problem if my in-database doesn't support essentially these predictive tools, right? If it wasn't one of the ones that I've mentioned earlier in this presentation. What do I do if it's already loaded it in this way? I can't process it in database. What you need to do is right-click on it, choose a tool version, and you can see in here, we've got different tool versions, so you're working with in-database one. You can just change it back to an in-memory one, and you're good to go, okay? For the purpose of this presentation, I could process it in database, but I just want, since this will work for everyone, no matter your database environment, I'm going to essentially externalize my data again out of the database back into the memory of my designer to do this analysis, okay? So what I'm going to do is go data stream out, get it out of my database, and then I could choose if I'm so inclined to just order them on output. In this case, since I'm doing logistic regression, it's not going to matter to me, so I'm not going to set any logic on sorting. Okay, so I'm going to go in to my predictive tools. I'm going to drop in a logistic regression. And just to make sure that everybody's on the same page and working together, I'm going to convert that over, drag it onto the canvas, and let's go ahead and build a model that will say if people will respond to our campaign. Now, I'm going to creatively name this model name, something probably no one's ever done before. I'm going to choose my target variable, and what I want to decide is how likely they are to respond to my campaign. And then next, I'm going to choose essentially what variables I want to predict that. So maybe I think that city is important. Maybe I'm interested in region, income, home value, how much they've spent in the past, right? All different options. Certainly, you could spend a whole course, and we do spend whole courses on predictive analytics, but I've just selected a few. I'm not saying this is going to be the best model ever. So we can go ahead and run that, make sure everything's working well. Perfect. Looks like our logistic regression is running. Okay. So now essentially I want to go ahead and score against this logistic regression, make sure it's working as expected. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in all my no responders to test against it. So what I could do is I could just use this data set and filter it in memory, right? But remember, I haven't skinnied it down. So what I could do is just go back in database and drop a filter, okay? And I'm going to drop a filter here. And let's go ahead and filter for every responder that was equal to no. So I'm going to choose responder is equal to no. And it's that easy. It's very similar to our filter tool. And our filter tool did go through some changes in the 2018 release. But if you remember, the version 11 and back, this was the experience. If I wanted to go in and create something more verbose beyond just responders equal to no, you go in here and start writing more of your expression logic. Now, again, be aware this is another touch point where leverage of that native language of that database becomes very handy, because if you're not speaking the same language or using the same function, this filter tool will not work for you. So be sure you do your research before you step into that world. Now, I'm going to go ahead and stream this data out of my database and run this against a score tool here. I'm going to convert this to be in memory again. Perfect. Okay. I'm going to name this, keep it score. I'll just keep all the defaults in here to see how it does. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to stream it back in database. Okay. So this is likely the scenario that many of you will use if you do not have in database predictive functionalities. And a lot of reasons why people stream into the Alteryx Designer is, hey, I just can't do this type of analysis inside my database, right? This is something only Alteryx can do. For a lot of people, it could be something as simple as transposing their data. It might be really complex to do that within their database, and they just need to be able to do it via Alteryx. That's another really great reason. Or it might be leveraging some of the great interfaces that we have out there, like in our regular expression tool, or just working in a familiar environment. That might be simply a simple enough reason for people to do this if it's not too time intensive. So I'm going to go ahead and set it up on my data stream and make sure it's creating that temporary table again. And now I'm just going to do a quick sample. I could output all my records to say how likely they are, but in this case, just for the sake of time and for the sake of demonstrating the sample tool, I'm just going to show you that I'm going to pick the top 10 records, right? And the nice thing about this is you can sample them based on an order, right? So I want to say who's my best scorers. I need to make sure I run this workflow to generate the variables. But that's a nice thing that actually, we might miss inside of the actual in-memory Alteryx Designer, is the ability to sort and sample in one tool rather than putting down two different tools. So I have my score yes. I'm going to make sure that's descending, so my highest scores, the highest responders will show up at the top, and I'll browse. Okay, so there you go. Those are my top 10 customers and the highest likelihood to respond. So this person, for a prediction, is a surefire thing to respond to our campaign. I'm so happy with this. I'm ready to write a table into my database. So I'm going to go ahead and connect write data in DB. Choose what I want to do. If I want to create a new table, right? If I want to overwrite it. If I already have an existing table, I just want to add data to it, I could just append existing. I could choose which data to delete and append, or just create a temporary table. In this case, I'm going to create a new permanent table, and I'll call it my top 10 responders. I'll go ahead and give it a run. Perfect, ran to completion. I'm going to go over here. See if I can get it to respond to me here. I may have disconnected from my session here. But you'll see, if I were to connect to it again, there you go, my top 10 responders. So now I could go in and view that data, and it sits inside my database now. So that's the very high level working in database workflow. Now some of you might say, hey, you know, what's really happening underneath the scenes here? What queries being run against my database? If you're a more advanced user and you just want to see what's happening, one of the things that you can leverage is this tool called Dynamic Output in DB. So what I can do is I can just connect it from my save tool, or my tool here. Oops, sorry, I selected the wrong one. Dynamic output, there we go. That's what I'm looking for. And you can see I can output the field's query and connection name, and it's bringing it back in memory, so I'll add a browse. And we can look at it one more time. And essentially, you'll see the query that was used in order to execute this workflow. Now, I will say that it will only capture the existing state from when you last went in database, right? So that, oops, I'm sorry, I left it on a create new table. I just want to start overwriting it now. So essentially what this query will represent is this chunk here, right? Where I last streamed in the database, what happened there, right? So if I wanted to see what happened here, I would connect a dynamic output in DB tool there to see the initial query before I got pushed into memory, and then I could see the query that was generated after the fact, right? So if I went in here, it's just a simple select from the top spenders, right? That's all that's really happening because I'm just selecting from this table. If I wanted to go back here and stream it out here, it might be a little bit of a longer query. We'll let that run. But you'll see that there's a little bit more to it there. So there you go. You can see there's a whole query. I could print this out to a separate sheet, but it is there. Okay. Now, here's a question a lot of people have right now. I have input data tool, and I already have a pre-built query that can query in database and get the same results. Should I use in database and regenerate that query? The answer is it depends, right? Anything that you're doing here, so let's take this for example where I'm streaming out, I'm just generating a query. Nothing is being executed against the database. So it's really no different than the input data tool that's connecting to the same database. These tools are not streaming data one at a time through them. They're just essentially pre-writing a SQL query for you and then cranking it out the output, okay? And that's very similar to the input data tool. However, in terms of maintenance and upkeep, it certainly could be more difficult if you're not SQL savvy to manage that input data tool that has that code written in there. So it might be easier to update your query and for all of the users on your team if you're sharing this workflow to be able to update a workflow like this. So that's another reason why you might choose one way or another. So I'm going to pause there and see if there's any more questions. Is there a way to validate your SQL code inside that tool? I'm sorry, I may have missed the time that was sent at. I'm guessing that it might be this this formula tool here. So the formula tool, you can have this check mark down below, validate expression here at runtime. So it'll essentially, you can click the run button and it will evaluate the whole SQL query that was generated as a result of these tools and see if it's a valid syntax before it actually executes that SQL against the database. So I could choose to select it here. If you deselected it, it would just run the query as is with these formulas and likely fail then. So I don't see that there's really any reason other than having this selected just to save you the time of waiting and finding out it fails later. So that might be a reason why you go that way. Any other questions? The question is, can you pass a set of values to the database to only query those values and return the results? I'm not sure I completely follow where we want to go with this question. They could follow a number of different ways, but I'd be more than happy to follow up with you after the session to kind of fill out the color on that. But I have a feeling what you're asking for is very much possible. Okay, so some support items, right? You have questions beyond today. You want to hear a little bit more about in-database workflows. What can I do? The first thing that you can do is the Alteryx community. I can't talk about it enough. There's a lot of resources there, and certainly the more that we can share about in-database, the better that we're going to be. The Alteryx Academy, now that certainly doesn't have a lot to do with in-database today, but we're always growing and expanding that, and we're hoping to roll out those more materials there on a quarterly basis. So keep your eyes out. And then finally, technical support. So if there's something that you've worked with your DBA, you're all credentialed properly, you've downloaded the right drivers, something's just not meshing, feel free to reach out to support@alteryx.com, and we'll make sure we get you along your way. So that will be it for today's session. I'll stay online here and just answer a few more questions as they filter in, and if not, we'll see you next week. So the question is, I might have a little bit more color to answer this. Can you pass a set of values to the database to only query those values and return those results? And so let's say our database has 1,000 materials and we want to return 10, right? What I might do in that case is I have an external file of the 10 materials that I want. I would push them in database with my data stream in option. I would interjoin them against your 1,000 materials table. So the output will be only the 10 materials that match, right, from that table. And there you go. You've passed your set of values, and now you've queried essentially just those values. Now, if you want to stream those back out for analysis, I would use the data stream out tool. Yeah, so you can stream that data in and join. Now, depending on what your final destination is, if you are working on creating a whole new table inside in database, then don't worry about streaming it out. If you need to bring it back out for analysis, then certainly you can data stream out again. So it'll probably be quick. 1,000 materials isn't a whole lot, so it probably doesn't matter too much if you're streaming your materials out and joining outside the database versus inside. So it's all up to you based on if you want it to be screaming fast or not. And we have another participant saying that's also really helpful. You could just generate an in list via formula. So materials in steel, right, cotton, polyester, you could just create a formula to literally filter those down inside your database. Unless those 10 materials are always changing, then it might be easier to join them in. So a couple of different directions you could go with that. Okay, so I think that's all we have for today. So thank you for joining. Join us next week, and we hope to see you soon. And if you haven't checked out Inspire and you want to learn more, feel free to sign up, join us. It's going to be a really fun time, and hope to see you there. We'll see you next week.